Here's a number that should bother you. The personal savings rate in America right now is hovering around 3.6%. 3.6. That means for every $100 an American earns, they're keeping less than 4 of it. The rest? Gone, spent, absorbed into the economy before the direct deposit notification even clears. Now, here's what makes that number genuinely disturbing. Back in 1975, Americans were saving over 17% of their income. In the early 1980s, it was still above 12%. Even after the financial crisis in 2008, a moment when the entire country was supposed to be scared straight about money, savings shot back up to 8%. And then it started falling again. Quietly, steadily, like a slow leak no one could find. So what happened between then and now? The easy answer is that Americans are irresponsible, that they've been seduced by DoorDash and Netflix and $7 lattes and they just can't stop spending. That's the answer you'll get from a certain kind of financial pundit, the kind who's never had to choose between fixing the car and making rent. But that answer is wrong. Or, more precisely, it's incomplete in a way that lets the actual problem off the hook entirely. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The math stopped working. Not because Americans got lazier or more reckless, but because the entire structure of middle-class financial life, the unspoken contract that said, work hard, spend reasonably, and you'll be fine, quietly collapsed, and most people didn't notice until they were already underwater. This is the story of how that happened.
Let's start with something basic. Saving money requires one condition. You have to spend less than you earn. That's it. That's the whole formula. It's not complicated, it's not controversial, and for most of the 20th century, it was actually achievable for a working American family. In 1970, a single income could support a family of 4, buy a house, put 2 kids through college, retire with some dignity. The math was tight, but it worked. What's happened since then isn't that people abandoned financial discipline. What happened is that the costs of the things that actually matter, housing, healthcare, education, childcare, has exploded at a rate that has nothing to do with your ability to skip avocado toast. Let's run the numbers. Since 1980, the cost of college has increased by over 1,200%. The cost of health care has gone up by more than 600%. Housing in major metros has increased anywhere from 400 to 800% depending on the city. And wages? Median real wages, adjusted for inflation, have grown by roughly 15 to 20% over the same period. Do that math slowly. Take a minute with it. The things that used to be the pillars of a stable American life cost 4 to 12 times more in real terms, and the paycheck that's supposed to cover them is basically the same as it was 40 years ago. This is not a lifestyle problem. This is a structural problem, and it has been building for decades, quietly, underneath the surface of a consumer economy that kept reassuring everyone that things were fine.
To understand why Americans can't save, you have to understand something about how the cost structure of modern life got redesigned, not by accident, but by a series of very deliberate policy choices and market forces that all pointed in the same direction. Start with housing, because housing is the biggest monthly expense for most families and the place where the math breaks down most visibly. The conventional rule of thumb says you should spend no more than 30% of your gross income on housing. That rule was developed in the 1960s and baked into federal housing assistance programs. It made sense at the time. Today, in cities like Los Angeles, New York, Miami, Denver, Austin, cities that have become engines of the modern economy, the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment eats 50, 60, sometimes 70% of a median income. 70%. That's before utilities, before groceries, before the car payment, before anything.
So already, before we've even talked about healthcare or student loans or childcare, a working family in a major American city is starting every month with almost nothing left, and they're supposed to be saving. Now add healthcare. The United States spends more on healthcare per capita than any other developed country on Earth, by a lot. Americans pay roughly twice what Germans pay, twice what Canadians pay, nearly 3 times what the average OECD country pays. And yet, over 100 million Americans carry medical debt. Not because they were reckless, because they got sick, or their kid got sick, or they needed a procedure their insurance technically covered but practically didn't. The average employer-sponsored family health plan now costs over $23,000 a year in total premiums. Employees pay a portion of that, usually around $6,000 to $7,000 just in premiums, and then they still face deductibles that can run $3,000 to $5,000 before the coverage kicks in much of anything. So you're a middle-class family, you're paying $7,000 a year just to have insurance, and you still have to find several more before the coverage kicks in. That's not a safety net, that's a financial trap with better marketing.
Now, let's talk about the debt machine, because this is where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean quietly infuriating. Americans now carry over $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. The average graduate leaves school with somewhere between $28,000 and $37,000 in loans. If you went to graduate school, professional school, or a private university, that number can easily be $100,000, $150,000, or more. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. A generation ago, you could work a summer job and cover a significant portion of your state school tuition. Minimum wage in 1980 was $3.10 an hour. Tuition at the average public university was around $800 a year. That's about 250 hours of work, 6 weeks of a summer job. Today, minimum wage at the federal level is still $7.25, lower in real terms than it was in 1968. And the average annual tuition at a public 4-year university is over $10,000. That's nearly 1,400 hours of work at minimum wage. That's working full-time for 7 months straight and spending every dollar just on tuition, nothing else. No rent, no food, no books, no life. So what happened? People borrowed, because the alternative, not going to college, was presented as financial suicide. The economy changed, the jobs changed, the credential requirements changed, and the price of admission to the middle class went from manageable to mathematically brutal. And then those graduates entered the workforce carrying debt, competing for jobs in a market that had been reshaped by technology and globalization, paying rent in cities that had been transformed by a decade of underbuilding and speculative investment, and trying to contribute to a retirement account while also servicing loans that compound interest on the margin every single month. The personal savings rate, remember? 3.6%. Now it makes a different kind of sense. But here's the part that almost never gets mentioned, the part that lives underneath all the statistics. The American economy runs on consumption. About 70% of GDP is driven by consumer spending. That's not a side effect. It's the design. And sustaining that level of consumption decade after decade as wages stagnated required a very elegant solution: credit. When wages stopped growing in real terms in the 1970s and 1980s, the economy didn't slow down, it extended credit instead. Credit cards, home equity loans, auto loans with 72-month terms, buy now, pay later apps on your phone. The financial system essentially handed American households a time machine. Spend tomorrow's money today, and the economy keeps humming. And it worked. For a while. Consumer credit in the United States now stands at over $5 trillion. Credit card debt alone crossed $1.1 trillion in 2023, a record. The average American household carrying a balance is paying roughly $1,000 a year in interest alone. Just interest, not paying down the principal, just the cost of carrying the debt. And the interest rates on that debt? The average credit card APR right now is above 20%. 20%! If you have $5,000 on a credit card at 20% APR and you make the minimum payment every month, you will be paying that card for over 20 years and spend more in interest than you originally borrowed. That's not a math error. That's the business model. So you have a system where stagnant wages forced people into debt, the debt charges compounding interest at extraordinary rates, and the money that might have gone into savings is instead flowing to financial institutions as interest payments every single month. The savings rate isn't low because Americans are bad at math. It's low because the system is extracting wealth from the middle class faster than the middle class can accumulate it.
Now, there's a version of this story that gets told every couple of years that goes something like this. Americans are finally learning to be smarter with money. The savings rate is ticking up. People are cutting back on subscriptions. The frugal living movement is real. And sometimes that's even true, temporarily. After COVID hit, the savings rate spiked to nearly 34%. People weren't spending because there was nowhere to spend. Plus, stimulus checks were hitting accounts. For one brief, strange moment, the savings numbers looked almost European. And then it collapsed. Pent-up demand, inflation, the return of every expense that had been paused, it all came flooding back. By 2023, the savings rate had fallen back to historic lows. The revenge spending era burned through whatever buffer most families had built and then some. And this is the cycle. Emergency forces savings, normal life destroys it, because the underlying math never changed. The financial media loves to run stories about the couple who paid off $200,000 in debt in 3 years by moving back in with parents and driving Uber on weekends and eating only lentils. And good for them, genuinely. But that story, for all its inspirational architecture, is describing an exception that requires extraordinary sacrifice just to achieve what used to be ordinary. And running that story as proof that the system works is a bit like pointing to someone who climbed out of a hole using a rope and saying, "See, no one needs a ladder."
Step back further and the picture gets darker. A society that can't save is a society that can't absorb shocks. When 60% of Americans can't cover an unexpected $1,000 expense without going into debt, and that's the actual number from Federal Reserve surveys, what you have is a population living permanently one bad month away from financial crisis. A medical bill, a car breakdown, a layoff that lasts 3 months instead of 3 weeks. These aren't rare events, these are normal life events. And for a majority of working Americans, any one of them is potentially catastrophic. This also means retirement is becoming a slow-motion disaster for a generation that hasn't fully hit it yet. The old system, pension, Social Security, company benefits, has been largely replaced with a system that says, here's a 401k, good luck. And the 401k system only works if you have discretionary income to contribute, your employer matches, you don't tap it during emergencies, and you stay invested for decades without panic selling. The median retirement savings for Americans between 55 and 64, the people who are supposed to be approaching the finish line, is around $134,000. The general guideline for a comfortable retirement is somewhere between $1 million and $1.5 million for a couple. That gap is not a planning failure. That is a systemic outcome for people who were doing everything they were told to do inside a system that no longer rewards it the way it once did. And this problem compounds across generations. Parents who can't retire on schedule stay in jobs longer. Adult children who carry student debt can't afford down payments and remain renters or move back home. Families that might have transferred wealth downward can't because they need that wealth to survive their own retirement. The financial stress doesn't just hurt individuals, it restructures family dynamics, delays household formation, suppresses birth rates, and hollows out communities.
Here's the part that should strike you as quietly absurd.
The financial advice industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry built on the premise that Americans need better money management guidance, has never been larger or more accessible. There are more personal finance books, podcasts, YouTube channels, apps, and influencers than at any point in history. And yet, the savings rate is 3.6%. If the problem were primarily behavioral, you'd expect that tsunami of financial education to have moved the needle by now. It hasn't, because you can give someone all the budgeting spreadsheets in the world, and if their rent is $2,400 and their take-home is $3,800, the spreadsheet just tells them the same thing they already know. There isn't enough. The personal finance industry, at its worst, has done something genuinely pernicious. It's taken a structural problem, the wage structures between wages and cost of living, and reframed it as a personal failing. You didn't save because you lacked discipline. You don't have an emergency fund because you made bad choices. You're not retirement ready because you weren't strategic enough. This framing is convenient for a lot of people. It keeps the focus on individual behavior and away from wage structures, housing policy, healthcare pricing, and the political decisions that shaped all of it. It also, not coincidentally, sells a lot of books.
So where does that leave us? The honest answer is that there's no clean ending here, no three-step fix, no simple policy lever that, if pulled, restores the savings culture of 1975. Housing costs can't be solved quickly, student debt exists and continues to accumulate. Healthcare in America is a negotiation between interests so entrenched that reform moves at geological speed. Wages at the bottom and middle have improved in recent years, but not enough, not fast enough, and not with inflationary pressures that eat into every gain. And in the meantime, real families in real places are making real choices. Not stupid choices, rational choices inside an irrational system. They're taking on debt to afford education because the alternative is being priced out of the middle class. They're renting because ownership requires a down payment that would take a decade to save on a median income. They're skipping the retirement contribution this month because the car needs brakes and the deductible just reset. The savings rate is a number, but it's also a signal. It's the economy's vital sign, the quiet measurement of whether the average person has any margin left, any buffer between what they earn and what it costs to simply exist in the country they were born in. And right now, that signal is telling us something that the GDP numbers and the stock market returns and the unemployment rate aren't. The numbers at the top look fine. It's the numbers in the middle that are blinking red. So the question worth sitting with isn't how do Americans save more money? That's the wrong question. It assumes the inputs are the same as they were when the formula was written. The better question is this. When the structure of the economy has changed this dramatically, when the cost of stability has outpaced the reward for work, who is the system actually designed for? And when you find the answer to that, the 3.6% stops being surprising. It starts being the most predictable number in the country.